All right. Hello, everybody out there. Good morning to those in the UK. Good afternoon and evening to those in China, and hello to everybody in between. We're delighted to have you joining our webinar this morning. I think our maybe 12th or 13th in our new platform of CBBC webinars. This morning we're talking about setting up a presence in China, guidance for the UK education sector. Our two speakers are Giles Blackburne, a director at CBBC, and Jeremy Sargent, managing partner at JS Associates. All right, so just before we begin, we'll just have a quick look through a few bits and pieces. The China-Britain Business Council is the leading organisation helping UK companies grow and develop their business with China. CBBC supports British companies of all sizes and at every stage of market entry with practical in-market assistance, services, industry initiatives, as well as a membership programme offering access, seminars and significant networking. CBBC works closely with UKTI and the FCO and has a strategic partnership with the British Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, providing corporate members with reciprocal membership. Our business-led board and professional team have extensive first-hand experience of doing business in China, and through almost 60 years of engagement, CBBC has built up exceptional connections with government and business across China. CBBC services are delivered through a network of 10 offices in the UK and 13 strategic locations across China. CBBC helps companies to network and learn from China-savvy multinationals and SMEs to understand the intricacies of doing business in China and to develop sound strategies for expanding in the fast-changing and dynamic marketplace that is modern China. So just to give you all a sense of our reach across the UK and across China. We have two new offices that were opened recently in Changsha, right there, and in Xi'an also. Okay, moving swiftly along. This is quite an interactive platform. We hope that you get involved with your questions. Feel free to drop in anything that you want to ask the speakers. I'm highlighting currently the area. If you want to drop in a question, please drop it in here. If it's pertinent to the flow of the webinar, what I will do is I will stop the speaker and ask them on the spot. Otherwise, we'll save it to the end. If we don't get to it at the end, the system records it and we'll make sure that someone follows up with you in due course. If I could ask now, if you can see that I'm highlighting the raise your hand button, if you could just click on that, and that will allow me to know whether or not you're receiving me loud and clear. So if you could click on the little raise your hand button, please. I can see some people are doing that. We get a couple more people. There we are. Very, very good. Very, very good students today. Fitting with our topic. All right. So if you have any questions, as I say, please just drop them into this little section here. Great. Okay. So moving along, I'd just like to introduce our two speakers quickly. Giles Blackburne is Director of Corporate Services at China-Britain Business Council with responsibility for the education sector and CBBC's Launchpad scheme. Giles graduated in Chinese Studies at the Polytechnic of Central London in 1989. He has worked for CBBC for 15 years and has also lectured in China-related topics at the universities of Glasgow, Abertay, St Andrews, Nottingham and Leeds. So we're very happy to have Giles here. Our next speaker this morning is Jeremy Sargent. Jeremy Sargent is the managing partner of JSA, a legal consulting firm headquartered in Guangzhou. Prior to founding JSA back in 2007, Jeremy was a partner with the London-based international law firm Stevenson Harwood, where he was responsible for the development of the firm's Guangzhou and Shanghai offices. Jeremy has worked in China for 15 years. Jeremy is no stranger to China, having first moved to Hong Kong with his family in the late 1970s. Jeremy completed his first degree in Chinese at the University of Leeds in England and was one of a handful of foreign students to study in China in the mid-1980s. The team at JSA assists international companies, foreign diplomatic missions and non-profit organizations with many of the legal aspects of establishing and operating businesses in China, with a particular focus on corporate, commercial, employment and regulatory work. Jeremy sits on a number of business-related committees and currently chairs the British Chamber of Commerce, Guangdong. In 2011, Jeremy was awarded an OBE by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in recognition of his contribution towards British business in China and legal services in China. So there are two expert speakers this morning. Very, very pleased to have them with us today. So as I said, this is quite a practical and interactive platform. So what I'd like to do first is just ask you all a question. Those of you familiar to this platform will know what I'm going to do. I always ask, where are you? So just to give our speakers a sense of where the attendees are and for my own sort of personal curiosity. So if you could please just click on wherever you are and then click submit at the bottom, and that will allow me to understand where all of you are. So I can see that about 2/3, nearly 3/4 of you had voted now. So if you could just click on wherever it is in the world that you are, that would be very helpful for our own records here at CBBC. We'll just give it one more second or so. Nearly there. Nearly there. Okay, I'll close that. And again, just to give you an understanding of where everyone is, you can see that 2/3 of the people are UK outside of London. Again, that's one of the reasons that we do this webinar platform, to give this kind of content and this kind of expertise to people who aren't necessarily, in the large cities or indeed in London. So we're very happy to have people from all over the place involved today. Okay, I'll hide that, and I will do one of the hopeful moments always in these. I will unmute our speakers, and I hope that they're still there. Giles and Jeremy, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Giles. Jeremy, are you there?
David. Hello, everybody.
Terrific. So Giles
Yes.
Giles is in the UK, and Jeremy is in China. At this point, Giles, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, David. I'd just like to take a few slides to set the context for today's webinar. So next slide, please, David. We've all been observing the state of play in China's education system, and we've noticed that it's experiencing a rapid expansion and development. And the drivers are twofold in this. First of all, there's a policy perspective. Many of you will be familiar with the outline of China's National Development Plan for Medium and Long-Term Education Reform and Development, 2010 to 2020. And there's, as well as the policy perspective, there's also the aspirations of ordinary Chinese people to achieve upward mobility, better employment prospects, and security for their families looking ahead. Certainly, in terms of the current dialogue in China, education is the key to the realization of what we're seeing as the Chinese dream. Those of you who follow Chinese politics would have noticed that China's new president, Xi Jinping, has this new doctrine, the Chinese dream, and the basic objectives of that are to unite the country, to allow China to complete its re-emergence as an economic power, and also to help the ordinary citizens realize their aspirations for prosperity and stability. Next slide, please. Just looking at some trends at the moment to set the scene for today. We have learned from China's plans that it's seeking to develop world-class universities, but we also know that the top-ranked Chinese HE institutions are still unable to meet demand. In the meantime, some reports have said recently that there's been a decline in the number of high school students sitting Chinese university entrance examinations. For some families, overseas education is becoming the first choice. And in the context of that, there is a much broader interest in the range of courses that they're interested in enrolling on. High net worth families are willing and able to send their children abroad, but there's an increased interest in private school education delivered in China as well, which we're noticing from our members and trends going on in China. There remains a healthy demand for specialist postgraduate education in the UK and delivered in China, but for ones in the UK, we've noticed that there's a trend in encouraging so-called continuation. That's to say, an element of a program offered in China for returnees. We believe that this is well perceived by the authorities there. There's increased effort to improve the quality and perception of vocational education in China. We've noticed from the recent city-level 5-year plans that cooperation with foreign institutes is greatly encouraged, which raises the possibilities for our institutions here. We also know that professional development and attainment of recognized qualifications is seen as key to upward mobility in a highly competitive employment market. So the presence of UK awarding bodies and links to UK professional institutions is very important and recognized as so in China. Next slide, please. Let's just consider the breadth of foreign involvement in China's education sector. all the way from higher education. We have institutions still concentrating a great deal on recruitment, the agreements on joint programs. We see the emergence of a few foreign campuses in China, which is a very exciting development. Short courses and executive training, research and commercial. And then on the vocational side, joint delivery of courses, teacher training, curriculum design, consultancy, around many of the industrial areas that Britain is well known for. On the school side, education in the UK, but also the emergence, as I mentioned before, of foreign schools in China. English language teaching in China, a very competitive market there, but also in the UK. And various types of professional training in management, sales, health and safety, accreditation awarding, and also professional institutions, membership of those and continuous professional development acting as a key, as I mentioned before. Next slide.
Giles, we had a poll that you were considering dropping in here. Shall I drop in the poll?
Yes.
All right, so this one is what's your area of business? So just to give Giles and Jeremy a bit more of an understanding of kind of what area you are currently involved with in the education sector and or not. So please, again, click whichever one is most relevant to you, please. Just give it another couple of seconds. Okay, we're nearly there. I think there's a pretty clear pattern emerging from my end. Just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'll close that. And just so everyone can see, so 36% higher education, vocational education, 21% schools or English language, 7% accreditation awarding, 0. We have no executive trainers, and we have 36% of the wonderful other. Any comment there, Giles, or shall I keep moving?
Keep moving, David, please.
Okay. Let me close it.
And really a closing slide before we move on, just about the keys to success that CBBC has been observing, not only for education but also in broader commercial contexts. We know that it's important to develop long-term relationships and partnerships in China, and we'll learn that particularly in the education sector that's key. In this webinar we'll also learn a bit about the regulations. What's key is going to be following the regulations, not finding shortcuts. We think it's important to convey offers in terms of China's goals, and I refer back to this long-named plan, this medium and long-term education reform and development plan. If you're able to convey your offer in terms of Chinese policy, it will be well received. We know from recent research that building visibility and credibility in the market is vital for to be recognized by the Chinese institutions and the Chinese decision makers, and which leads us on to the subject really of having a presence in the market, and that's what we're talking about today, setting up a presence in China. So with that, I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Okay, good morning to those in the UK and good afternoon to people here in China. It's been a very wet spring English weather here. I should firstly say a big thank you to CBBC and in particular to Giles and David for arranging today's talk and all the work that's gone into it. I'm going to be talking, as Giles mentioned, about sort of various options that can be considered for an education provider. And I use the word education fairly broadly, as you'll see when I go into my slides, because the spectrum between sort of pure education on one end and then right down to sort of training, English language schools, vocational training, and so on. There's obviously a big spectrum there where, as I said, on one end you have education and then you look at what would be considered more commercial type activities, so profit making, training and that type of thing. I think as a starting point, and I fully appreciate that many people who are out on this call today will have experience in China, possibly having set things up in China already or having people on the ground in China, you know, as a general starting point, and I think I would say this to whichever audience I was speaking to, and that is, you know, from a legal perspective, China's law can be quite tricky, patchy, vague, imperfect, not always easy to follow. China is essentially a system governed by administrative organs of government. I say to clients, you will rarely see a Chinese courtroom, but you may often see a Chinese government department office. And this presents challenges because understanding the legislation, the framework, who the authors are of the particular legislation, who you need to go to get approval, what for. And this may sound somewhat odd, but it's very much the case that it's not always entirely clear. And therefore I say to people it can be a little bit like peeling an onion, layer by layer. And it's not for the faint-hearted, it's not for the impatient. It's a process of due diligence which is fundamental. And in my 15+ years here in China, as a generalization, the projects that tend to succeed in China tend to be ones which have been well thought out from day one. To do this obviously requires time, resource, due diligence, verification. We hear so much about China, whether in the media, whether sitting next to somebody on the aeroplane, maybe a newsletter thrown out by a firm like mine, maybe from a government official at a banquet. And sometimes it doesn't sort of all tie together so well. Government departments in China aren't always the best of friends. There is tensions between central and local. There are tensions on a horizontal level between different departments who believe they have jurisdiction over a particular area of the economy. And this can play out in many, many ways, and it's something to be very aware of. Having said that, there is a clear legal basis for foreign participation in China, whether in the commercial sector, the education sector, and so on. And there are many, many success stories that we all know. And this is partly the reason why China is still up there as one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment annually. Moving more specifically into today's talk, my first slide, a bit of an odd title, Educational Business. But I think it is important to consider this. And from my own experience of dealing with, in inverted commas, education providers, whether they be a university, a vocational training college, a language school, a nanny training centre in London, and so on, we need to really look at whether it is truly education or is there a commercial element. And the reason I say that is because once you've categorized where you are, it will have a huge impact on the route that you follow to establish and set up. And there'll be many, many differences from how you can set up, what the policies are, who you need to go to get the relevant approval, how much it will cost you, how much flexibility you have in operational terms, and so on. Today what I'm going to do is really summarize, and we've got half an hour or so to 40 minutes or so to talk about possible ways to get boots on the ground to set up a physical presence in China. There's no one way that fits all, and it will very much depend on your specific requirements and what you're looking to try and do. And education in particular, because education is so broad and it's so specific at the same time, depending on the nature of the course, what the end result is, what the reason is. Are you here to market UK universities to incoming Chinese students? Are you here to try and make direct profits out of the Chinese market? What are your future plans in terms of expansion, and so on? So in today's talk, I'm really going to summarize, I guess, 5 options. Again, I should stress it's not as simple as, well, option 1 works and option 2 doesn't. But I think what it does mean is you consider all 5, and there may be others. They're not even necessarily 5 perfectly clean, black and white distinct options.
Jeremy, I think we have a quick poll, I think, to illustrate your first question, the commercial and education, just to give Jeremy a perspective of who's listening this morning. So if you could click whether or not you think your motivation is commercial, whether or not you think it's educational, a bit of both, or maybe other. So this will, again, I think this goes to the heart of how Jeremy is framing this split between education and or business, and will also help him just to pitch his speeches, to pitch his words a little bit. So we're nearly there. If you could just click on which is the most relevant to you. Nearly there. We'll give it a couple more seconds. I shall close that and share it with the team. So 24% commercial, 12% education, and 65% both. Back over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, David. Actually, that's really helpful, and I'm not surprised by those results. And that actually ties in very much with what I'm going to say for the rest of the talk. Can I have the next slide, please? So moving swiftly on, as I say, these are not really distinct options per se, but just thoughts to explore. Option one, what I call an informal presence, and I've seen this before in my many years in Guangzhou and Shanghai. I've seen UK, well, everything from UK universities to independent private language centres set up a so-called informal presence in China. And how do they do that? There are many ways people do it. I mean, at its most basic form, perhaps they send their executives, their academics, their people on and off planes on a regular basis, hand out name cards, perhaps have a local Chinese telephone number, and start by claiming some form of informal presence. I've seen situations where colleges, universities have started their foray into China by sharing an office, renting a desk. Sometimes they don't even pay rent at a local Chinese college or university, or even a company, a training company or consulting company. So they'll stick their desk there. They may have a person sat there. They print up some name cards, and they often adopt a, well, let's start this way. It's cheap. It's easy. It will give us some eyes and ears on the ground and give us an opportunity to look at whether there's a viable business here in China. Alongside that, perhaps going a step further, signing some type of, or entering into some kind of what I call loose contractual arrangement. So we've seen, typically a training company based in the UK, they may partner up with a training company that has students, has classrooms, has this and has that. In China here, the Chinese company will co-brand. They may use the trademark under license of the UK party. They may endorse their courses, saying this is a UK endorsed or affiliated type of course, great for marketing, getting people in. They may even issue informal qualification certificates in their joint names. The UK part of that arrangement will receive money, consulting fees, training fees through various means, sometimes paid offshore through a Hong Kong affiliate, sometimes paid directly to the UK company from China. I mean, it really varies from case by case. Requires a bit of creativity to make it happen. Third sub-bullet point here is, and this is very common, not just in the education sector, but across the board. We see this, probably as Giles will know, on a weekly basis. We talk to people who have found somebody on the ground in China to represent their interests. As a lawyer, I should probably say that all of these, while commercially they may make a lot of sense, they're a cheap, easy, effective way to get started very quickly in China. But what they also do is bypass government approval, government registration. As we all know, in China, virtually any foreign involvement in China, whether in commercial or education field, requires government approval. So operating under the radar, yes, people do it. I can't advise that it's legal, but it is a way that people use quite successfully to kind of get their toe into the water, perhaps on a 6-month or 1-year trial basis. I've thrown a few of the types of risks. I mean, there's many risks, but point one, an unregistered business. Now, frankly, in 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I first came here, many people were doing this. And part of the reason for that was that in many cases, it was difficult to know what you were meant to do or how to register. They have got a lot more sophisticated. The government has upgraded its technology, its supervision, its reporting mechanisms, and the classic case is you set something up very innocuously, small scale. As long as everything goes fine, it's probably not an issue, but one day you annoy the wrong person, a competitor discovers you're doing this, one of your consultants or employees or whoever decides to get back at you for whatever reason, one report to the government, you get that knock on the door, and that is a very real and growing risk as I think virtually anybody here operating business would agree with. There are taxation risks, particularly when you have consultants running around China on your behalf. They're unlikely to be paying tax. They receive an income, often paid in cash or just a TT to their personal bank account. Not only does this violate tax, there's probably a foreign exchange control issue there. And again, China's a big country, nobody's watching everybody, but when somebody decides they're not happy with you, it's that one phone call. And we should also note that the government has set up hotlines for reporting this type of thing, and they're becoming much, much more aggressive, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years. There is a tax risk from the perspective of the UK entity, the university or the company or training school or whatever, that by setting up a presence in China, they make it unwittingly created what we call a permanent establishment, which is taxable. Not only should it be registered, but it also may be subject to tax in China. The chances of getting caught may be slim, but again, something to bear in mind. I think the third point is definitely possibly one of the largest of the risks that I've highlighted here, and that is employment generally. Invariably, an informal arrangement requires people on the ground, and without having an entity in China, a legally registered entity, you cannot employ people here legally. I'll come on to that on my last slide, but just a point to bear in mind. If you have Chinese nationals running around for you, claiming to be employees or consultants, Chinese law does not recognize employment by foreign overseas companies of Chinese nationals. So there's certainly risks there to think about. If some kind of employment relationship is argued, you probably don't have an employment contract. Chinese law recognizes what we call de facto employment. I won't bore everybody with all the details there, but you may unwittingly find yourself subject to an employment type claim when you have absolutely no intention of striking up an employment relationship. And then finally, and sort of underpinning all of this, is yes, you could argue, well, the risks aren't big. In China, if things go wrong, there are normally ways of sorting them out. However, it may damage your reputation, your credibility in the market. People talk a lot here. It gets into the media. If you're a well-known institution, it's happened to a number of foreign universities in China where the media get hold of these stories, blow it out of all proportion, and that doesn't do very well for your reputation amongst Chinese students. And there's also a possibility of even being blacklisted. So if at a later point you do want to set up, that's something to, a possibility of blacklisting. So I talked a bit about the sort of informal presence, which is very, very common, but it is risky. Can I have the next slide, please? So moving on, and at the beginning we talked, is it education, is it business? We go sort of to the heart of that, I guess. Option 2 is really, if you are really wishing, in the true sense of the word education, to set up a program in China, then it is possible. Since China joined the WTO back in 2001, a very firm commitment was made to opening up its education sector to foreign participation. Also ties in with the types of issues that Giles mentioned in his introduction. Prior to that, it was very difficult, and it was very much ad hoc. But in 2003, I remember being here at the time, it was big news because the Ministry of Education issued a pretty landmark set of regulations which, for the first time, gave a very clear legal basis for education providers from overseas to come into China and to set up in China. It is very strictly regulated. Ultimately, the supervision is under the ministry level, Ministry of Education. For certain types of projects, you may get away with provincials. So here in Guangzhou, that would be the Guangdong Education Department's approval. The rather vaguely worded rules, I mean, most legislation in China is fairly vaguely worded, which can be a good and a bad thing. But it talks about the type of education that China needs, quality, high quality. It also makes it clear that areas such as religion and politics and so on are clearly excluded. And key points, I think, a key point I should mention there is that, you know, the so-called compulsory education sector, that's the, I think it's the 6 to 14-year-olds, the junior high school level, foreign participation in that sector is currently not allowed, other than setting up international schools which strictly serve expatriate children. Local children are not allowed. If they were, I think their doors would be trampled down very quickly. Talked to my friends at the British school here in Guangzhou. So the so-called non-compulsory education, that's preschool, senior secretary, university, and so on, is clearly allowed as a clear legal framework for foreign participation. I won't, the regulations are quite comprehensive. There are implementing regulations and other various notices and supplements issued subsequent to this legislation that sort of fill in some of the gaps. I've picked out really some of the key points for the purposes of today. And first key point is you cannot do it on your own. So if you wish to set up a course or even an institution, an education institution, solely, wholly owned by the foreign party, that's not allowed. That contrasts with business, where in most cases wholly foreign-owned companies, or WOOFIes as we call them for short, not only are they permitted, they're also extremely popular. The regulations, under the regulations, it's possible to, so firstly you have to go in as a joint venture with a partner. Secondly, they contemplate two things really. One is setting up joint venture institutions, so actual colleges, even universities, and there have been a handful. I think Nottingham and Liverpool and the Northern Consortium, and one or two from the US and Hong Kong have set up joint venture institutions. But much more commonly is specific projects. So it could be a type of course within a college or within a university, which may lead to foreign qualifications. It may be a foundation for finishing off the course overseas. What I read recently, I don't know if this is true, this was reported that there are almost 1,000 such joint, what they call joint educational projects dotted across the country, contrasted to only a small handful, probably less than 10, if my figures are correct, actual joint venture education institutions. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Moving on this option 2, another key point, which is, I guess, good and bad, is that education in China under the education law is supposedly non-profit making, again rather vaguely worded, and this concept also appears under the 2003 regulations. Having said that, we have seen joint courses where, you know, obviously the foreign party is not coming to China as a charity in most cases. There are some where they are, but they will recoup money in the form of fees, teaching fees, various funds, and so on. And this will vary from case to case. But, you know, frankly, in a lot of cases, despite the non-profit making, you know, obligation, it is permitted to make some form of return. And so careful structuring based on the specific course and location and everything else is important. You know, everything about these courses is pretty much going to be regulated, including the level of tuition fees, local currency only. A very key point to make is, you know, diploma. A lot of people ask about, you know, whether such a project can issue a foreign qualification, and the answer is yes, it may. If a foreign qualification is intended, this will make the approval more complex. They will form some kind of working party within the Ministry of Education. They will evaluate the diploma and so on. But it is permitted as our non-diploma or local Chinese diploma qualifications. Both parties will invest into it. The law is pretty vague, but typically cash. You know, a common scenario that we've seen would be some cash from the foreign partner. The Chinese partner will often put in physical infrastructure, buildings, use of buildings, equipment, classrooms, and so on. IP is also permitted to be contributed. It should be valued. A basic principle in China is any kind of non-cash contribution into any project requires valuation and appraisal. If the Chinese entity, which is very likely if it's a university, is a state-owned entity, then there's a whole another raft of valuation processes. Obviously, as I said earlier, it needs approval, and it's a fairly, I don't think arduous is quite the right word, but let's call it bureaucratic approval process. Depending on the type of project or institution you're setting up, if it's diploma, it certainly has to go up to the provincial, central level, ministry level in Beijing, as with higher education. Provincial would cover non-diploma preschool education, but it's not entirely clear, and this goes back to my point on careful, clear, objective due diligence and verification at every step. Normally takes two-stage process, usually. That can be fast-tracked, but generally two-stage, taking, it's going to realistically take you a good 6 to 9 months to complete, assuming the approval is granted. And I know that, the reality is a lot of foreign education institutes will already have some track record in China. They will have made the contacts, they would have been in discussions, they would have had informal liaison with the ministry or the provincial education people, and so on. And there's a lot of documentation that needs to be prepared. You need to prove who you are, what you're going to contribute, your assets. You need to sign an agreement with the Chinese party, a project agreement, a bit like a joint venture contract. In my experience, we've seen everything from very sophisticated agreements to, frankly, we were helping one of the UK colleges a couple of years back, and frankly, a very, very scrappy and surprising document which was approved, and it was a 4-page, badly written, poorly translated, very vague document, but that was approved at the provincial level in that case. The actual management, either a board of directors or what's called a joint administrative committee, at least 5 individuals, 50%, at least 50% Chinese. The president must be a Chinese citizen. What this really means, and for lots of reasons, and given that we're getting into something which is very much controlled and driven by the state, is that ultimate control and ultimate operation, frankly, at the end of the day, the Chinese party will have a much bigger hand in the whole thing, which again can be good, but it's something to bear in mind compared to a purely commercial situation. A lot of challenges with setting up a joint venture project in China, a mismatch of expectations. What is the real rationale for the project? Who are the key drivers? As Giles said, does it tie in with what the state wants? Does it tie in with what the Ministry of Education is really looking for? Who's getting what benefits? Frankly, the Chinese universities are run like businesses in many cases, and financial gain is at the forefront of almost anything here, I think I can say without being too controversial. The project is approved. You're not allowed to set up branches across the country. It's one project in one location. If you want to set up another one, you have to go through this all again at another location. And finally, like I said, all aspects of the setup, from the establishment, the documentation, the recruitment of students, the course materials, the qualification of teachers you may wish to bring over, and the delivery of courses and so on will be under the strict supervision of the government. Although, having said that, again, back to my opening remarks, the enforcement, as in anything in China, varies massively from place to place, project to project. And it's not necessarily something to be alarmed or scared of, but more to be aware of, and goes back to the due diligence point, understand what you're actually getting yourself into. So that's, in a nutshell, a huge subject in a nutshell. That's for pure education. You're a university in the UK, you may want to set up an undergraduate program at a Chinese university, a master's program, a foundation program with a university. That would clearly come fall within the ambit of education, and these points would apply there. Next slide, please.
Jeremy, we have a quick poll here just to give you a chance to get a mouthful of tea. You've been going for.
Yeah, I'm doing exactly that.
Yeah, no problem, no problem at all. So I'm going to launch a poll here. We've looked at some of the different business, the different entities that you can. So I'm going to launch a poll called "Do you have an education sector entity. So where are you on your China journey thus far? So if you could please click on the one that's relevant to you. No, but we're planning one in the next 12 months or so. Yes, and we're pleased with it. Yes, but we're not so pleased with it. So if you could just click on the one that's relevant to you, please. And please drop in your questions. Haven't had a question yet through, other than technical ones. So if you have some content questions, please drop them in, and I'll pass them on to the speakers as we go along. Anything at all, please feel free to drop it in. All right, we're nearly done there. Have you had a good mouthful of tea, Jeremy? Are you ready to go again?
I'm ready to go.
So 39% no, 28% no, but we're planning one in the next 12 months or so, 28% yes, and we're pleased with it, and 0 yes, but we're not pleased with it, so 6% other. So a bit of a range there, Jeremy.
Quite an optimistic group by the looks of it. 28% are pleased. That's very encouraging, obviously.
Okay, I'll move along, and you should be on to your next option.
Great. Next option, and I'm sure a lot of you will have read all the newsletters and heard all about what's going on with representative offices. Maybe going back a few years, when I first came to China, the representative office was an extremely common, simple and straightforward way of creating a legally established presence in China. And what we saw back then is, every man and his dog was setting up a rep office to do virtually anything. They were tolerated. Rep offices grew. We saw rep offices with 250 employees who were essentially running businesses through their rep offices. A rep office is an important point. Talking from a legal perspective, a rep office is not an independent legal entity. So it's not like a company which has its own legal personality. It's an independent entity. Instead, all the rep office really is a registration of the foreign entity, the foreign parent. So if you're a company in London and you register a Guangzhou rep office, legally speaking, that rep office is really purely an extension of the London company, which happens to be registered here in China. It's a physical presence on the ground. The key point here, well, there's a few key points, but one is an overseas education entity, so university, for example, may not directly register a representative office in China. So, the University of X, Guangzhou representative office would not be permitted. And what people tend to do, and I'm sure many people at today's seminar have done, those who have a presence in China, would, through establishing an offshore company, a lot of universities, colleges and so on, will have private companies who will set up a private company, and then that private company will then apply to register a rep office. So it becomes sort of commercial. It's an interesting concept because ultimately it's a way for a foreign university or education institute to set up an office on the ground in China, but it's doing it through a commercial structure. Possibly a bit risky, and you have to think about even sort of common sense things like what name do you use. If you set up, the University of X Limited, and then use that to set up your rep office in Guangzhou, okay, it's maybe the offshore company, maybe a private company, but I don't think you get very far with the registration. So quite common would be, instead of the University of X Limited Guangzhou Representative Office, it might be something like X Consulting, maybe the word education will come in there somewhere, or training, limited, and Guangzhou Representative Office. That being said, we are aware of the fact, and it's been reported in the media with one or two universities, including one or two well-known ones from the US, this sort of slightly backdoor way around the regulation doesn't go completely unnoticed, and particularly where the rep office then employs staff who are handing out name cards with the University of X plastered all over it, a reception area, university brochures and everything else sitting there. It's possible, many people do it. I'm not saying don't do it specifically, but be aware that there is a potential risk there. I think a key point to mention about rep offices generally, whether in this sector or indeed any sector, is that a rep office may not engage in any direct business. And fairly recent new regulations issued a couple of years back really reinforce this point. I said earlier, in the old days, rep offices of 200 people, effectively doing everything that a business does. They have really significantly cracked down on that, and they're now cracking down more and more on it, to the extent that the word on the street is that the Chinese government's ultimate aim is to actually virtually phase out rep offices altogether. I don't know if that's true or not. What a rep office can do, and this was reinforced again in the recent regulations, is so-called liaison. And liaison, again, is limited to market research, promotion, and marketing type activities. Arguably, anything that goes beyond that, you know, and I say arguably because this may be a bit of a stretch, but it's been commented on before. You know, once you get into contract negotiation, providing any kind of value-added service to anybody, arguably it exceeds the permitted liaison business scope. And they've increased the penalties for rep offices that do that, including fines. In serious cases, they could cancel the license, they could confiscate income, and so on. And interestingly, the new regulations were also jointly issued by the Public Security Bureau. So not only the Ministry of Commerce, but the Public Security Bureau and other departments jointly issued regulations. The Public Security Bureau is effectively the Chinese police. And I think what they were getting out of it here is that people had used rep offices a lot in the past as a way of putting foreign expatriates on the ground in China, and a relatively easy way to get them work permits.
Jeremy, I have a question here. Jeremy, I have a question here from Jack, and he asks, if a university is to set up a new co for rep office purpose, does the new co have to be operating for more than 2 years?
The answer is correct. Something I should have but didn't put in my slide. The new co should at least have existed for 2 years. Operating, it seems so far, certainly in the cities that we've worked in, such as Guangzhou, Shanghai, and the major ones, provided you could provide a incorporation document which is at least 2 years old, they will not wish to see evidence of substantive operations. So the answer is yes, you do need. But you can buy you can buy an off-the-shelf company that's got a 2-year history. In fact, we're doing exactly that for clients at the moment. In this case, it's a Hong Kong company that's been around for more than 2 years, specifically because the client's setting up a rep office in Suzhou. So yeah,
all right, thanks for that. That should answer Jack's question. Thank you.
Pleasure. I'd say relatively, in the big scheme of things, and certainly compared, and you can't really compare a rep office to a joint program that I talked about earlier. It's a totally different situation. The rep office is a good way. It's a good way, really. It's a better alternative to option one. Option one being sort of unregistered presence on the ground and renting desks, etc. The rep office is a good way to formalise some form of presence. It's not going to be the answer to everything. It's limited in what it can and can't do, but it allows you to have a presence in China, to employ people in China, to employ expatriates in China, to survey the market, to start talking about possible partners, to find out what's going on, where the opportunities are. You know, and a huge cliche to say it, but you know, and I'll say it again and again to whoever I'm talking to. You know, realistically, to do anything in China, it's very, very difficult to develop a business in China without having what I call boots on the ground here, having some form of presence on the ground. Doing it remotely, people don't take it very seriously. Obviously, if you're Cambridge University, it's a different story, but if you're an English language school from Birmingham, how are you meant to develop anything without having a presence on the ground in China? I think it's very, very difficult. Even Hong Kong companies find this problem, even though they're 2 hours on the train from where I'm sitting now. Another point on rep offices, from a tax perspective, they're getting more and more burdensome. The new rules have increased tax, and it may sound illogical. The rep office doesn't generate income directly, it doesn't do business. However, it will be subject to tax on a withholding basis, and there's a formula that is used which basically looks at expenditure and based on expenditure, they'll compute a tax rate, broadly between 10 and 15% of expenditure. So if you've got a rep office operating in China, you need to look at your monthly expenditure to keep it up and running. The rent, the salaries, the copy machine, the photocopier rental, the travelling, the taxi fares. You have to put it all, crunch it all together and add another 10 to 15, in some cases 20% on top, and you will be paying that on a monthly basis as tax. So that, compared to setting up a company, which I'll talk about in a moment, is not necessarily the most efficient model from a tax point of view. If it's a very small-scale operation, it may not be a big issue. A final point on rep offices, employment, not that this is a big deal per se, but a rep office, because it's not an independent legal entity in China, it's really a foreign company. It may not directly recruit Chinese employees. It rather has to recruit them via a local government labour agency. It's pretty much paperwork, broadly, nothing to be duly alarmed about. It's a little bit of extra cost, typically around 250 renminbi per employee per month to add on to the wage costs. But interestingly, it ties in with what I was saying earlier, the new rules, and people were quite shocked when they saw this, placed a limitation on the number of foreigners who can come and work for a rep office, so-called representatives, and it's now limited them to 4. In the old days, there was no limitation. And I know anecdotally, we're seeing in certain parts of China, foreign nationals who are employed by their China rep offices are finding it difficult to get work permits or even renew existing work permits, something I'll touch on my last slide today. So that's, in a nutshell, some of the key points on the rep office. It's a great way of getting the presence going, a short-term option, I guess. You can't really do much other than liaison, but it's fairly cheap, fairly simple to set up, despite the restrictions I mentioned, and it has to be done through a 2-year-old offshore company. Next slide, please.
While we're moving on, I have a question here again. Any impact on the rep office staff employment through FESCO with the new labour contract law kicking in on the 1st of July?
Good question. If you don't mind me, perhaps I could talk about that a little bit on my last slide. I'll make a note to...
That's fine. That's fine. Just conscious now to keep it as close to an hour as we can, so hopefully we can keep things moving. Thanks, Jeremy.
Pleasure. Okay, so moving swiftly on. The next option is the wholly foreign enterprise. I think virtually everyone on this seminar will know the WFOE that everyone's been talking about for the last 20-odd years. This is a pretty common approach, frankly, particularly for the people who are not strictly bringing education projects to China, but really more on the commercial side. And we've seen many from universities, colleges, training centres, language schools, and so on set up, incorporate a company in China in the form of a WFOE. As its name suggests, it's 100% foreign ownership. It's a limited liability company. Chinese law recognises the corporate veil, the limited liability concept, as in the same way that English law, UK law does. It's an independent legal entity, fully owned and controlled by the foreign investor. As in the case of the rep office, the WFOE must have an investor, an offshore company. That 2-year requirement does not apply here. Instead, a brand new, newly incorporated NewCo can apply to set up a WFOE anywhere in China. Important and of key importance here, I guess, is any WFOE, whatever it's doing in China, unlike a British company that can do virtually anything without specific approval, a WFOE is only approved to conduct business within its so-called permitted scope of business. That is an actual sentence that will appear on the WFOE's business license. If you make widgets on your business license, it will say the WFOE's business scope is the making and selling of widgets. That doesn't mean you can then engage in operating a hotel or setting up a restaurant. So the key question here for anyone broadly involved in training, education, vocational training, is how do you get the business scope that's going to kind of fit with what you want. And education, or WOOFI providing education services, you're not going to get the license saying that. So the typical approach, if there is one, the normal approach, is to craft something along the lines of business consulting. And that's what we've seen, and we've worked on many such projects all over China. So management consulting, business consulting, information consulting, enterprise consulting is generally acceptable anywhere in China. Interestingly, in fact, we've just completed a project for a company which is in the education. It's not a university, it's a private company out of the UK, but they design and recruit and put together courses and all sorts of other things. In that case, we were able to get a business scope of education information consulting. And this was here in Guangzhou. We tried in Shanghai, and the Shanghai government said no way. In Guangzhou, there was a little bit of umming and ahhing. We visited the local BOF, they're called, the approval authority. It's nothing to do with the education department, and they approved it. But this is just a classic example of how China works. In Guangzhou, you can get that. In Shanghai, you can't. And there'll be many, many situations like that, the other way around too. So it goes back to the due diligence, and this may restrict where you even set up. Education information consulting is very, very broad. It's very vague, and to some degree, it gives the WOOFI the opportunity to do quite a lot. And we've seen people using WOOFIs with consulting business scopes to run training schools, training programs, to provide services to Chinese education institutes, to cooperate in the loose sense of the word, not the joint program approach, but and sometimes, frankly, it's all going to be a bit of a grey area. We see some quite bold examples where even universities have stepped quite far towards joint programs, but through the WOOFI approach. Now, that approach, you wouldn't be able to issue diplomas, for example, or qualifications. But the WOOFI is pretty easy to set up. As I said, it's fully controlled by you. There's no partner, no nothing. An interesting point: vocational training. The Chinese government, their foreign investment catalogue, the recent amendment, put vocational training as an encouraged industry for foreign investment. However, so far, to my knowledge, and I'm not pretending that we know everything, but we've looked at trying to get vocational training into the business scope of the WOOFI, and they wouldn't do it. The reason being they're waiting for guidance from the higher level authorities. I suspect, this was going back a few months, things may have changed recently, but I suspect we will see vocational training a more sort of clearly regulated approval process, and WOOFIs with a vocational training business scope may well be on the horizon. This was the feedback we got from when we visited the local authorities here in Guangzhou. Just a general sort of point, and I guess this doesn't just come under WOOFIs, but just a point that many of you will be aware of. Recruitment of Chinese students is a regulated activity in China. Although there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of so-called recruitment agents floating around China, strictly speaking, only those who are licensed and have recruitment licenses under Chinese law are Chinese companies are allowed to do this. Many do it anyway, but certainly as a WOOFI, you will not get that license. So if you're in the recruitment business, you would not be able to get a license to do it. Next slide, please.
Quick question, Jeremy, I have here. Could the investor for a WOOFI be a UK citizen, an individual, or an LLP instead of a UK limited?
The answer to that question is yes. As a matter of law, an individual can invest into a WOOFI. However, in my 15 years experience here, I've only seen one such case, and I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay.
For lots of reasons, including personal liability if things go wrong, having the sort of limited liability layer in the form of a shell company is good, and so on and so forth.
No, fair point.
Yes, and it has been done.
Okay. Another quick question here from Chris. in terms of business scope, is this limited to regions, provinces, municipalities, or does it cover the whole country?
Good question. It covers the whole. It covers the whole country. So there's no restriction once you've got your. Well, there's no geographical restriction. Let me answer this. I've answered it in too simplistic a way. If you have a Guangzhou Whoopee with a business scope of X, you're not limited to Guangzhou in terms of your operation. However, if you set up a presence in another part of China in some form, there is a strong argument that you should register a branch there. And in the example I gave of here in Guangzhou, you can get education information consulting. If you wanted to register a branch in another city in China with that same business scope, it would then be at the discretion of the local authority whether they approve it or not, the branch establishment. But the basic answer is you're not restricted territorially within a certain city or province in terms of who your customers are and what you're doing. But if you create a presence like you have if you want a team of employees sitting in Beijing, you should register a branch there, and the business scope of that branch may not be as broad as the head would be. Moving quickly on to the last points on Woofy here, which everybody can read. I won't dwell. I'm aware of time moving on here. Capitalization. This is a question that people are always asking. You know, how much money do we need to stick in? The simple answer, as a matter of law, is only 100,000 RMB. That's the Chinese company law. Applies to Whoopies or Chinese-owned companies equally. But the reality is, and this goes back to my first slide on due diligence and verification, local districts and some cities, despite this, without any clear legal basis, will be insisting on a higher amount, and they will not be willing to approve small projects. We've seen exactly this. The district I'm sitting in Guangzhou, if you want to set up a consulting Woofy, you need 800,000 RMB. Without that, they won't approve it. They've got no legal basis, really, not to. You cross a few blocks down from where I'm sitting into Tianhe district, 100,000 RMB, no problem. And we did one recently for a training company. So what we call a local reality check before committing anything to paper, before submitting anything for approval, before putting any money anywhere, do a local reality check. Whatever you're setting up, wherever you are in China, it doesn't take long, it's not complicated to do, but it can save you a huge amount of time. We're dealing with a British company at the moment that has set up in Dongguan only to discover that the registered capital was set at $1 million US, and they've already got the license. And this company is not able to pay in. And under the Chinese law, if you fail to pay in your registered capital or any installments of it, your approval becomes voided. So a bit of a problem, and they're now trying to work out a way around it. So the minimum registered capital is local reality check is the message there. Fairly simple to set up a Woofy in terms of what we're talking about. If you want to set up a Woofy in oil exploration, no, it's not simple. But for a consulting training type Woofy, pretty easy to set up. You need to crunch through documentation, submit it. It's a process that from start to finish takes time. Could be done in 4 months, but I normally say 5 to 6 months. You need to register with all the various government departments. It's more sophisticated than people think. A lot of it's now online registration. It's not some nasty office where some unfriendly official has the arbitrariness to say yes or no. It follows a very well-trodden path. And in my 15 years here, I've yet to work on a project that hasn't been approved. There are always little wrinkles along the way. Each district is different, each city is different, and that goes back to the local reality checkpoint. It saves you a huge amount of time and money. Management, Woofy requires a board of directors. For a small-scale Woofy, which is not defined, 1 executive director is allowed, but this is unusual, but generally a minimum of 3. One of whom is the legal representative. That's an important position. The legal rep, that person effectively is stepping into the shoes of the Woofy, could be personally liable if the Woofy misbehaves. His or her name will be on the business license. Question people always ask, do we use somebody in China, do we use someone in the UK, outside of China? It really depends. From a sort of risk mitigation perspective, probably having somebody not in China is good, because if anything goes wrong, if ever you get that knock on the door in China, the first person the authorities will want to talk to is the legal rep. Obviously, if they're sitting in Birmingham or London, safer. Having said that, from an operational point of view, you know, when you go to open the bank account, when you do this, that, the legal rep may have to appear. So, and it can be changed at any time in the future. Another point, misconception, you know, the directors and legal rep need not be Chinese nationals, need not be resident in China, need not ever visit China. There's no restrictions such as that. And another statutory position, Chinese companies have a general manager. That's a statutory position. That person's name is registered with the authorities. They're responsible for the day-to-day operation. Obviously, the scope of authority of the general manager, it's sensible to consider that carefully. It can be limited in the Articles of Association of the WFOE, in the general manager's employment contract, by appointing, say, a deputy general manager, and having an overall management structure, because this is a challenge that a lot of UK companies have, particularly smaller and medium companies that don't have huge resources to put their own people on the ground in China. It's how to make sure things are being properly managed. Bank signing authorities is increasingly common. We see that. So, you know, access and signing authority of bank accounts can be set up fairly creatively. Tax, I mentioned rep offices with tax based on expenses. WFOEs, they're companies. If you don't make a profit, you don't pay profit tax. So the rate of profit tax in China is 25%. Business income, so if you're receiving a training fee or a consulting fee, generally subject to an upfront tax of 5%, although this is being phased out in favour of VAT. And if you do make a profit, once you've paid all your tax and other statutory contributions, before remitting your profit out of China, there is a withholding tax, normally 10%. I believe to the UK it's 10%. If the investor is in certain jurisdictions, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., that can be reduced. So tax advice is always recommended. But the point here is much more tax efficient than a rep office. And in fact, we see this as one of the drivers why people are moving away from rep offices. They're closing them down because they want, especially if they get to a certain size, they crunch through the figures and work out they're actually chucking a lot of tax away. Unlike rep offices, which are not independent entities, unlike joint programs, once you've got a WFOE, you can set up branches anywhere you want in China. So you can have 20 branches across China if you wanted. You may hire Chinese employees directly. You may hire foreign employees. There's no limit to the number of foreign employees legally, unlike a rep office with a small. But very important to note work permit and residence permit for foreigners, and that'll be one of my final points today. Moving swiftly on to the last option 5 here.
Jeremy, if I can just ask a quick question, please.
Yeah.
It's Giles here. One question we frequently get is that an organisation, an institution may have a representative office already, and it wants to set up a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. Very briefly, please, what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications are people always say, I want to convert from a rep office to a WFOE. In practice, that's what you're doing, but in reality, you're not doing that. The only way to do that is you have to deregister your rep office and set up the WFOE from scratch. There's no conversion. A rep office isn't a legal, independent legal entity. You can't convert it to anything. So what you need to do is to deregister the rep office, a fairly tedious 6 to 9 month process. If your books are in order, mainly tax and accounting, if all of that is in order, it should be fairly straightforward. We've worked on many such projects. Where the problems come is when the tax deregistration. It's the last chance for the tax authority in China, like they would probably anywhere else in the world, to get their last bite of the cherry, so to speak. And they will often go through everything with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any areas of non-compliance. So this is a very good reason in itself why running a compliant business makes business sense. Forget morally or otherwise, clear business sense. I spoke earlier about setting up a WFOE and very briefly on the process. One challenge to bear in mind, which is a practical one, is to set up any form of entity in China, whether rep office, WFOE or otherwise, you need to have a physical location before you can do anything. And a challenge that some people have, they have a Guangzhou rep office leasing an office, they want to set up a WFOE. How do they time it in terms of the premises? because they will need a new lease agreement, and you can't have a rep office and a Whoopee sharing in the same place legally. So there are ways around it. We've seen cases where people have relocated their rep office to a very tiny office down the road for the purposes of going through the dispute registration. Then on to the penultimate slide, I believe.
I have a quick question, Jeremy, if I could.
On joint venture enterprise. Yeah.
Just a quick question from Alan. This is just a point to clear up. Actually, two people have asked this one. But he says, very basic question, does a Hong Kong limited company count as overseas? I.e., does it need to establish a legal presence on the mainland before starting business activities? I think for somebody new to China, that's an important distinction.
That's a very good question, which is asked a lot. Despite one country, two systems, and Hong Kong being part of China, the very simple answer to that is absolutely yes. Virtually everything that I've talked about today applies as much to a British company as a Hong Kong company. So Hong Kong companies, and I say Hong Kong companies with substance, i.e. not just a newco or a shelf company which has been set up for convenience, but a Hong Kong company that's already operational in Hong Kong may enjoy certain privileges in terms of setting up in China. But any investment from Hong Kong is still counted as foreign direct investment. So the simple answer is yes, no difference.
All right, thanks for that.
Pleasure. My penultimate slide here, and I'm going to be very quick on this one. The joint venture, really the joint venture and the Whoopee are very similar. That sounds ridiculous, but they're extremely similar. The only real key difference being a Whoopee is wholly foreign owned, a joint venture is partly foreign owned. So a joint venture has a Chinese partner. In all other respects, pretty much, as I put in the slide here, and I won't go through them one by one, in all other respects, a joint venture, which is a limited liability company, and a Whoopee are treated exactly the same. In terms of the setting up process, the approval process, the capitalization, the business scope questions that we talked about earlier, the establishment process, the management, more or less the same. Slight differences on the authority of the board of directors, but I won't go too much into detail on that. Taxation the same, employment the same, so everything is the same. The fundamental difference between a Whoopee and a joint venture is obviously a joint venture has a Chinese partner. You'll need a joint venture contract. It will not be solely owned by the foreign party, and by having that joint venture contract then means things like the board of directors, which is the highest organ of authority of a joint venture, will have both Chinese and foreign directors, and everything that goes with that. And that would apply to a joint venture between two parties in the UK too. There's a big difference between operating by yourself and operating with a partner or a shareholder. Joint ventures are no longer particularly popular. In certain industries, they are still required. As I say, in education, if you want to set up an education program, you have to go through have a partner. In most cases nowadays, it's been phased out. I believe Whoopees account for something like 85 to 90% of projects. Having said that, there may well be reasons why commercially a joint venture makes a lot of sense. I'm not one of these people who just slag off joint ventures as being bad for the sake of it. Most of them haven't worked well for lots and lots of reasons. The business environment between China and the UK, business ethics, understanding of law, expectations, management style can be very, very different. And that often creates a situation where there's a deadlock, the JV doesn't work. And in the old days, not so much now, but in the old days, we did a significant amount of work converting joint ventures into Whoopees by the foreign party acquiring the Chinese party's interest. So I don't know I need to say much more about joint ventures because it follows pretty much line for line what I said about Whoopees. Next slide, please. In fact, the next few slides are all really touching on this big area in China, which we call employment. If you read virtually any survey, business confidence survey, ease of doing business in China survey, and so on, employment is invariably identified as, if not the most challenging aspect of being in China, certainly within the top 2 or 3. There's lots of reasons for that, not least being foreign companies will come in with a different culture. The Chinese labour market has changed from sort of the iron rice bowl to being a bit of a free-for-all in a very short period of time. Mobility of people, pressure on Chinese employees to earn money. China is very expensive for people to live. Massive scarcity of qualified people, certainly at the higher end, the managerial level. That's why salaries are so high at that level. Hordes of graduates coming onto the market, but frankly not well educated. This is the feedback we hear from clients all the time. You have to find graduates and then start training them. And this creates a lot of challenges. I think another important point here, frankly, is, and I see it, and we're dealing with a project exactly like this as we speak. A lot of foreign companies, they ignore employment in China now. They set up, they rely on a local HR person to advise them. They want to replicate their UK-style handbook in China. They don't understand the intricacies of the labour contract law. They don't understand the fact that if you try and fire somebody, you will lose the case if it goes to court or arbitration. 90% of cases, you will lose, unless you have extremely strong evidence. The burden of proof is firmly on the employer. Unlike, say, Hong Kong, UK I'm not so familiar with. Hong Kong you can terminate at will by giving notice. In China you can't. You can only terminate if there is a reason set out clearly under the law. And termination of employees is a major issue. If you have an employee who's just not really cutting it, very difficult to terminate them. And if you do, you're likely to get that arbitration notice on your desk, and you're likely to lose. So you're likely to get out your checkbook and say, okay, we're going to pay you off, sign a termination agreement. And this is the path that's trodden by so many companies in China, large and small. Employment's expensive, wages are going up fast, and add to the base salary another sort of 30+% in terms of the equivalent of national insurance type contributions that an employer has to make. I touched on a couple of these in my slide here, other issues. I've touched on a couple of things before. An important point is the ad hoc consultancy. We see this happen all the time. We see a company based outside of China saying, yeah, we've got 3 employees in China, and they may even sign an employment contract between the foreign company and the Chinese employee. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, not good, risky, probably wouldn't be recognised as an employment relationship. If it were, you haven't got an employment contract, there are issues there. If it isn't, there could be a civil liability. What happens when that person gets knocked over by a bus on the way to his or her work that day? You would be liable as a matter of PRC law. Do you have health insurance, accident insurance? These are all, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, but these are real questions that I've seen real life examples of it going wrong. And with some sensible planning and thinking carefully about HR practice and understanding that, you can avoid a lot of this. And then finally, next slide please. My last, actually 3 slides, but I won't talk through slide by slide each one. Obviously, as a foreign education training type company, you're selling a foreign product. That's clear. That's one area where Chinese can't compete so easily. And invariably, that means putting foreigners into China to either deliver courses, quality control, to promote and market, and so on. And it's becoming quite challenging because new rules will come in shortly from the 1st of July. A general tightening up on a perceived increasing number of people, foreigners working illegally in China. It's true that many foreigners get 12-month F visas coming in and out. And I know people who've worked here for 15 years without a work permit. In the old days, no one really cared, but now they're making it much, much stricter. Guangzhou province here is being earmarked as a pilot province, and I'm currently going through my own work permit renewal, and they're very strict, and will get stricter. Again, I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm not trying to make things out to be more complicated than they are. But I think the point where it was a little bit of a free-for-all. You could get your 12-month or 2-year multiple entry visa, come in and out, not worry about the niceties of the work permits, are starting to come to an end. Foreigners now have to pay social insurance. That was introduced 18 months ago or so. Implementation of that's been a bit patchy. I believe in Shanghai they haven't started. They've made it optional. In Guangzhou here, certain districts seem to, certain don't. You imagine if you're a foreign school with 150 foreign teachers, that adds a huge amount onto your payroll. When you're looking at a good 4,000 or 5,000 RMB per teacher per month that has to be paid over. Probably not much greater more to say about work permits. In my final slide here, go to the final slide, and maybe the next slide, please. We've got application. Yeah, I won't bore everyone by going through this line by line, but it's like it's so often the case in China. It's not hugely complicated to get the work permit, but it's quite bureaucratic. It takes a good 4, if you're lucky, maybe 6, 7 weeks. What we noticed is they're being far more, the authorities are being far more rigorous in their substantive review of the application. In the old days, it was more or less ticking the boxes and you got a permit. Now, they want to see your resume. They want to know what your previous employment record was. They may now, we're just seeing this with the clients at the moment, they want evidence of their previous employment. That gets tricky when your foreign staff member may have already been in China for 2 or 3 years on an F visa. How do you then go and apply for the permit? They've also introduced a 2-year minimum work experience requirement. So fresh graduates, no longer possible to employ directly. And we've seen cases of people having to leave China because of that. July the 1st, the new law comes in. This will give the police the powers to detain for up to, I believe, 30 days or longer foreign nationals caught working illegally. Foreign employers of those nationals will be fined, and it's reported. And again, I'll stress again to everybody, not trying to be alarmist here, but it is reported that education and language schools, in particular English teachers, are the number of illegally working English teachers has largely driven this. I also think, frankly, there is a political dimension to this whole subject. A bit of muscle flexing, a bit of deflectionary tactics. Without going into too much detail on it, foreigners are quite an easy target too. Last year there was a fairly unpleasant anti-foreign campaign going on across China, and as a foreigner working and living here, you certainly felt that. It seems to have blown over a bit. So I think that's, given time, I've slightly run over, I apologise, but I think that's my bit for today, unless anybody, David, it's a Q&A, and I know we've run over a little bit.
That's all right. Giles, you wanted to mention a couple of things at this point.
Yes, Jeremy's certainly given us a lot of food for thought. We accept that setting up in China in the education sector needs a lot of understanding, it needs a lot of preparation, it needs adherence to the laws, and it also there's the employment angle as well on this. And so I just wanted to, for those of you who don't know about CBBC's Launchpad program, just to say a few words about that. It's a program that we offer in China to help companies and organizations have an interim presence there, to have somebody legally engaged there. It's been favored by educational institutions. Nearly 30 universities have either had a presence or have a presence via CBBC's Launchpad scheme, which is offered across our offices in China. Professional institutions and accreditation agencies also have had a presence via Launchpad. The idea is behind it is that we learnt before that it's not permissible to employ somebody without having a registered presence there. China-Britain Business Council makes that problem go away by acting as the employer under its rep office license. We provide a desk. The staff member is selected by and works exclusively for the client back here in the UK. It's very quick to enter. It's easy to withdraw with minimum risk, and it's cost-effective for education institutions. we found that during the time in Launchpad, companies can understand the market better, they can build credibility and visibility, the important aspects that I mentioned before, access new contacts, and generally speaking, institutions or companies stay with CBBC 2 or 3 years before graduating from the scheme and setting up their own office, whether that be a rep office or a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, and that staff member is transferred to the new entity and becomes a key member of the team, often the chief representative or the general manager. So that's the program, the scheme at CBBC that I look after, and if anybody's interested and wants to take a breath in China before setting up something serious, then do talk to me. Thank you, David.
All right, great. I have a couple of questions here. I'm conscious that we're moving along time-wise, but I still think we have time for a few. One thing that we didn't touch on and is raised by Richard here, he'd just be interested in hearing how the presenters feel the best routes to market are ultimately. I think in terms of, I guess that's getting students involved, be that digital and or otherwise. Giles, do you want to lead on that one?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's a question about visibility. The routes to making yourself visible are much broader nowadays, using various types of social media in partnership with a physical presence on the ground. It does take time to make yourselves visible and build up a name. You could call it an investment, if you will, in having somebody on the ground and using these social networks. So it is possible, but through association and relationships with the right people, through getting a good message and consistent message across, it is possible to find those routes to market. That's my comment on that one.
Sure, Jeremy, have you anything else to add on that?
Not much. I mean, I agree with everything Giles said. I think we have to also bear in mind, being quite frank here, there's a lot of scams going on in China. China is not a particularly trusting society. There is often an assumption that someone you don't know is going to rip you off. So if you're trying to build, an image and a brand and develop a business in China, it goes back to my earlier point of being on the ground and being able to meet people and not being in and out or just at the end of an email. And I think as a generalization, I get this message again and again and again. So I think that's
okay, fair enough. Thanks for that. I've got one technical question here. This is from Wu. Are students allowed to pay tuition directly to UK institutions when they study in China for jointly developed programs? That might be a little technical right out of the trap there. Jeremy, are you best one to lead on that?
I believe the technical answer to that is no. In practice, who knows? In practice, lots of things happen in China when it comes to structuring contracts, payment, and so on. What is clear for the joint program that we talk about, they should be invoiced in renminbi locally. And the delivery of the service, there's a fundamental concept in China under the foreign exchange regulation. That is, if the services that are delivered within China should be paid for within China.
Okay.
By not doing that, you're evading foreign exchange and possibly tax legislation.
Fair enough. Giles, anything to add there, or shall I move on?
Nothing to add there.
All right, great. I've got one. A couple of people have asked about this in different guises, but people seem a little bit sort of concerned is maybe the wrong word, but interested in the recruitment process, and a few people have described it as a bit grey occasionally, and maybe even some boarding schools over here or colleges over here there's been some sort of a grey element to it. Giles, have you any thoughts on that?
Well, Jeremy mentioned before that China is full of grey areas. I suppose it's and yes, indeed, recruitment is a kind of regulated area. To be frank, I don't know the answer to that, but I would be able to take soundings from other people about it if
sure. If perhaps a couple of definitely don't do's and things that are probably okay to do. Jeremy, any thoughts there?
I think it's certainly a grey area. There's two ways of looking at that. let's say you were a UK institution of some description. You wanted to recruit Chinese students. Obviously, through the process that I mentioned earlier, you could set up your rep office or set up your work field. In reality, the people working at your rep office will be promoting. I suppose against that, the rules on recruitment, on actual recruitment of Chinese students to go overseas are pretty clear. You're not meant to do it without a license. I think one tip there is if you're not receiving fees for that service in China, you could argue that you're not really doing the recruitment, but you're doing some kind of marketing. I know it sounds a bit...
No, I mean, it's a grey area, so grey answers are okay too.
Let's face it, yeah, it's a grey area. But if you were, so-and-so institution, Guangzhou Wufi, you probably wouldn't want to put a big recruitment ad in the Guangzhou Daily saying we're all meeting at the Garden Hotel and we're going to sign up students there. That you couldn't do. But there's nothing to stop you on a one-on-one basis talking to students and sharing information. And then perhaps the paperwork and the money trail and everything would go between the student and the offshore UK institution. That's what lots and lots of people do.
All right. Thank you for that. Perhaps we could do maybe a closing statement.
Sorry, just.
Yeah, Jeremy?
Sorry, David. I was going to say, or what we've also seen, they may collaborate with a licensed agent, so the actual licensed agent effectively is the front for that.
Okay.
Whereas they're providing the back-end service, yeah.
Sure. They're the means of getting around it. All right, good. Perhaps we could do maybe a closing statement from both of you. Maybe Giles, if there's something you'd like to sort of wrap up with, or a thought or a takeaway for our listeners today.
Yeah, I suppose it's about the competition in China for the various types of or elements of the education sector that we've been talking about. China is really fiercely competitive. You're not only competing against foreign institutions, you're also competing against domestic institutions. You may be known in your own country but not in China. You may notice that some companies that aren't particularly known in this country are doing particularly well in China. So I'd be mindful of the competitive environment in China, and that should be part of your research to find how to position yourself and what is going on amongst other competitors.
Thanks for that. Jeremy, some closing words from yourself?
I think the key is to really soul search and understand what it is you're looking to do and get out of your adventures in China, both initially and in some short, medium and long term, and based on a clear, well-reasoned and thought-out oversight of all of that, then start working on what structures would work for you, and then do your reality checks and get as much information as possible and do as much due diligence as possible to really, like I said at the beginning, peel as many layers of the onion as you can, because there are a lot of bad layers and a lot of misleading layers in there on all levels, and then get to a point where you're comfortable with what you're trying to do. And don't think, well, everyone's trying to get into China, so I should. It has to work for you.
All right. Well, thanks very much. So thanks to our two speakers today, to Giles and Jeremy. I hope that gives our listeners an insight into the different ways to set up an education company or have that presence on mainland China. Moving along, if you do like our webinars, please feel free to go to our webpage. You can find on our front page at What We Do, you just drop down. This is where we keep all of the information about upcoming webinars and also past webinars. So if you have a colleague or friend who really should have seen this session and didn't, or perhaps you didn't catch it yourself the first time around, we record these and we post both the presentations and the broadcast online. So that's really it from me. If you have any feedback, please feel free to contact me, that's myself. If there's a question that we didn't get to today, I'll pass it on to the speakers. If there's a topic that you'd like us to cover in the future, or you'd just like to have a bit more contact with CBBC, please feel free to get in touch, get in contact with me. So that's really it from me. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope this was useful for you. We have plenty more webinars and other events in the pipeline. I think in June we have one on the new tax treaty and also a basic introduction to doing transactions in China. So you can find all the information about that on our webpage. So I wish you all the best for today, and thanks very much for joining. Bye now.
Thank you.